In this episode, the featured film takes the viewer into the not-too-distant futuristic world of genetic engineering and the search for human perfection, follows an underdog and his lifelong pursuit of an almost impossible goal of reaching for the stars, and adds in a nice little murder mystery and a nice little romance. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Gattaca was released in 1997. And that's a full 60 years on from last episode's movie, Shall We Dance? In fact, Gattaca is my favorite film released in the last 30 years. So I asked myself, why is this so? Why do I like this film from beginning to end? From the first seconds of the opening credits to the last second of the last scene. As a movie fan, I often ask myself, why do some films hit me the way they do? Now, I know I come into a film with a checklist of sorts that speaks to my expectations, but then I realize that sometimes one of my favorite films is the complete opposite of another favorite film. So I'm going to start with titles. As I've said many times in the past, I love a good title. Now, The Day of the Jackal, From Russia with Love, To Catch a Thief, they're all good, catchy titles. I can't say that's true about Gattaca. We'll talk about the meaning of Gattaca later on. But so, if a great film, I think, starts with a great title, then how come I like a film that doesn't have a great title? That's one of my first concerns. Then we have credits. Now, I like credits where there's a lot going on, where the powers behind the film are taking the time to maybe add a little extra, bringing us into the movie right from the opening seconds with either interesting titles or something on the screen that's compelling or foreshadows what's going to happen. And Gattaca satisfies all those needs. It has a simple blue background, white text, but there's things going on during these credits that are hard to explain, and only a watching of the film will explain it. So it's like, what's happening here? What's going on? What are all these images in and behind these credits? So I find that's terrific. But then I think of The Searchers and Shall We Dance and To Catch a Thief. There was nothing fancy about the credits in those films. In fact, I think the biggest decision that was made for them was what font to use for the titles. Then again, there's Chinatown, where that incredible horn that comes in about 10 or 15 seconds into the opening credits just sets a tone and feel for the entire movie. So my checklist on credits is checked on some films I like and not checked on other films I like. But as far as Gattaca goes, the titles, the credits, the opening credits are all terrific. And as I say, foreshadows something that's coming later. And the best thing is we don't really know what it's telling us, but those credits are telling us something. Next up is soundtrack. You know, I love a good soundtrack. And Gattaca has a tremendous soundtrack. It takes about 80 seconds for it to start. We're watching these credits, we're watching things happening on screen, we're not quite sure what's going on. But then when the title card comes up with the name Gattaca, that's when the music starts. And I find it incredibly melancholy and also hopeful. I mean, it really draws me into this movie like no soundtrack I've ever heard. It's not unlike my reaction when watching Chinatown and when that horn starts playing and it just sets the tone for another perhaps melancholy, tragic story, but with potential. So this is a characteristic of some of my favorite films. But then I think of the films from the 30s, and recently spoke of Shall We Dance, a film I like very much. Well, the soundtrack there is typical of the 1930s, big orchestras, and is anything but amusing. I find it sometimes hard to get past. It's not exactly my favorite. Sometimes it gets in the way of the story. But that is, in those films, certainly Shall We Dance, that's forgivable because the songs and the song and dance numbers are so terrific. So here I have a film I like very much, Shall We Dance, and then a film like Gattaca, and the soundtracks are at extreme opposites. So there's another checklist that says, yes, this is important for me liking films, but wait a minute, here's a film without a good soundtrack and I like it too. So that's another one to think about. Next up is voiceovers. Now, some film critics scream about voiceovers. They hate them. They say film is a visual medium and everything should be done visually or through the dialogue between the actors, and there should be no voiceover. Well, that's fair comment, and films absolutely are a visual medium, but if you're going to tell a story, why not use all the tools that are available to you? So I consider voiceover, when it's done well, fantastic. It either helps us, it sets a tone, it adds information without being too intrusive, and by and large, I have a lot of films I like that have voiceover narration. And as soon as I say that, films like Chinatown, one of my favorite films, To Catch a Thief, one of my favorite films, there's no narration in it at all, no voiceover. And yet I love them to death. But in Gattaca, it works, and it works really well, because there's a lot going on in this film. It is a science fiction film. It's a futuristic film. So rather than show us all these futuristic things, it has to tell us a few things and tell us where we are. Because one of the best things about Gattaca, which I think is a brilliant move on behalf of the people who made this film, was not to start at the beginning, but start in the middle of things, and then after a little while go back. And what the voiceover narration does is help us go back and set up the story. So narration, I like, check mark. If it's not there but the story doesn't need it, that's great. If the story doesn't need it and it's there, that can be a real problem. So in Gattaca, it really works. Narration, that's a plus. Now, cast, of course, is critical. And that's the fun part of watching older movies, where you don't really know anybody. You don't recognize any faces. You just go with what's up on the screen. You either like them or you don't like them. You recognize, well, that actor and actress, they really capture the screen. They really explode off the screen. 1955, To Catch a Thief, as I spoke about with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. I mean, if you've never seen them before, never heard of them, you'd be hard-pressed not to say, these two are stars. And they really carry a picture, and that's really important to the enjoyment of a film. Now, can great stars be in films that don't work? Of course. So story has a lot to do with that. Now, in this one, released in 1997, not only are these actors still alive, but they might actually be recognizable to some modern-day moviegoers. Ethan Hawke is our hero. Uma Thurman is the female co-worker in the company called Gattaca. And Jude plays an extremely critical role in this film that I don't want to say too much about. And those are our three, and they're all, I think, perfectly cast in this film. It might have been Jude Law's first film, that doesn't really matter too much. They just all do a terrific job. And as I say, one of my pleasures, or one of the reasons why I like some films so much, is the actors are very well cast. The supporting actors do their job. It just kind of works all the way through, and you don't get distracted. For example, in Chinatown, I confess that I'm not a huge fan of Jack Nicholson. I don't watch a lot of his films, but in Chinatown, he's just magnificent. And there are other actors like that I can, John Wayne of the 40s and 50s made some films that I watch, and he plays the same character all the time. But in The Searchers, he was magnificent. Cary Grant, it's hard to deny, many films he made which are really watchable and enjoyable. And of course, Grace Kelly is spectacular no matter what she did. So the casting also leads towards whether or not I like a film a lot or not. And in Gattaca, I just think the entire cast works exceptionally well. And finally, in my checklist is the story. Perhaps the most important thing for me is the story. I'm a big fan of well-written scripts. I'm a big fan of good stories that don't have a lot of wasted time in them, tangential stories that don't seem to lead back to the main story. I find those films can be problematic, but in Gattaca, it's right on the money. There's many layers to this film. There is genetic engineering, there's a murder mystery, there's a bit of a love story, and there's an actor's problem with perfection and how he's trying to deal with that. And they all point to the same goal. This is also true of Chinatown, of The Searchers, of To Catch a Thief. Even though To Catch a Thief is not a multi-layered film, Shall We Dance is anything but a multi-layered film. As I said, plot in Shall We Dance is just to hold the movie together enough so that we can get from one song and dance to the next song and dance to the next song and dance. And it works terrifically. You know, they're very, very lightweight comedies, and you know, it doesn't really matter. They're the same but different in 4 of my favorite Astaire Rogers films. To Catch a Thief has a nice little murder mystery. It's not earth-shattering. It's not incredibly involved and difficult to figure out, but it works. But it's not a really layered film, but I love the film to death. Chinatown is very layered, and this film, Gattaca, has a very layered story. And I think it's put together terrifically well in that they're talking about some very complicated subjects: genetic engineering, perfection, the results of genetic engineering in society. Does it change society? And again, they're also it is a science fiction film, so they're talking about the future. Well, so I asked my colleagues, my friends, my movie friends, why is it that we like some films so much? We can say, well, it hit all our boxes on our checklist, and that's why we like it. But then again, this one didn't hit any of the boxes on our checklist, and we like it just as much. And I find this is the fun of watching movies, that sometimes you just never know what to expect. You never know that a simple story, a light, fluffy comedy is just going to suck you in, and it's just going to be wonderful from start to finish. And then a mystery that is really well written, with twists and turns and layered, is going to suck you in and going to be spectacular. And yet those two films have very little in common except their storytelling and their good storytelling. And so that's why I like movies so much, is because you just never know what to expect. And if you go in with your checklist like I do and think, okay, it better hit all these boxes or I'm not going to like it, you put yourself in a bad place to enjoy the film. So I say, yes, I have a checklist, but I'm going to see what this movie has to offer, and we'll go from there. Now, I'm not a big science fiction movie fan. I've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, perhaps the must-see for the science fiction group. There's a lot of science fiction I don't particularly care for, but this film, as I said, I love everything about this film. And one of the reasons is it says the not too distant future right at the beginning of this film. And in fact, I would say this not too distant future is today. Now, it sounds funny because for me, Gattaca seems like it was just released the other day, but it was released 30 years ago. And it talks about a world where there's genetic engineering, where human beings can be modified in the womb. But in fact, research into DNA is getting very, very close to that. And so it's almost like it isn't really science fiction, at least it might have been in 1997, although there was a lot of research at that point into DNA. But today, it's advanced enormous amounts in the last 30 years. Now, what exactly are they talking about when they talk about this genetic engineering? And let's go back to the title. Now, Gattaca is the name of a company in the movie. And this company, what they do is they send people into space. And in fact, they don't send them in once every few years like the shuttle or something. They have 10 to 12 launches every single day. And that definitely puts it into the not too distant future, or even more than that distant future. But it isn't fancy. It's not like the Star Trek films, which are terrific films with their CGI and just amazing what they can do on screen with the spaceships that are traveling at light speed or faster than light speed. It's not like that. It's just a simple rocket. It looks like a rocket from the 1960s, but it's at a distance. So all we see is the plume of the exhaust from the rocket at quite a distance, and we know it's a rocket because it's heading up into space. And so I think that's a brilliant decision by the makers of this film not to go overboard or too much on the style of these ships. They're just very ordinary looking, and they're launching every couple of hours from this company called Gattaca. So Gattaca is a play on letters. And I have to read this because whatever I know about DNA, or you do, or how to say it properly, this is not going to be a chemistry lesson. But there are 4 letters, G, A, T, and C, which are the first letters of 4 elements or bases in DNA. And these are the elements which are responsible for life. And so if you can manipulate these elements, these bases, you can manipulate the genetic makeup of that DNA cell. So GATC, it's not too hard to get from that to Gattaca. So that was, I think, certainly clever. And if Gattaca doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, it's not awful either. So it works just fine. So we're talking about DNA and manipulating the bases, these chemical elements inside DNA. So what exactly does that mean? Unlike some science fiction films where it makes these creatures or individuals incredibly different from the rest of us, monstrously different, and they take over worlds and they fight and all that, it's not like that at all. Again, I guess that's why I like this science fiction film, because it isn't like those kinds of science fiction films. What they're doing is they're looking at preventing diseases primarily, and then a few other things. In fact, they're talking about eliminating disease, also things like mood disorders, heart disease, Parkinson's, premature baldness, right-handed as opposed to left-handed, color of skin. So some of it's very ordinary, and some of it, of course, makes for a healthier person. So this film, it goes as far as to say we're going to make healthier people, not super men and women, but healthier with lifespans, I suppose, well beyond 90 years of age, with very little risk of catastrophic illness, and leave the rest, the other things, still to fate. Now this is, I think, a very worthwhile endeavor, depending how you look at these things. But imagine children who suffer from catastrophic diseases and die very young. If those in the womb, if the DNA could be modified such that these diseases could be identified and removed or somehow become inactive, that seems to me to be a very, very good thing, because I experienced that myself with my sister, who died very young from cancer. She contracted a very rare disease at the age of 14 and died at 16. And if there was some sort of engineering available, genetic engineering available to have prevented that, who wouldn't be in favor of that? So that's what's the core of Gattaca is about. It's about these people who are genetically superior to the extent that they are healthier, IQs are better, eyesight is of course perfect, or even beyond perfect if that's possible, but there's a problem. And the film identifies a couple of problems. One is, not everybody is genetically engineered, which means you have two classes of society, the genetically engineered and the non-genetically engineered, and that creates a problem, a tension, and the film addresses that tension. The other element is that the film isn't a documentary. Gattaca is not a documentary. It doesn't begin with the advent of genetic engineering. That might have a place in another movie, but it isn't here. And that's, again, I think, another brilliant stroke on behalf of the powers behind this film. If we look at the company of Gattaca, where I think the youngest person looks late 20s at best, they're probably 30s and 40s, all of these people are genetically engineered, which means that the genetic engineering began 30 or 40 years before the start of this film, in the sequence in the film, and therefore it's a done deal. It's like nobody talks about it. It's not a big deal. It's just what people do. Now, why some people are engineered and some people aren't engineered is hard to say. Is it financial? Are there other reasons? Who knows? The simple fact is almost everybody in Gattaca is genetically engineered, because it's a very elite company. They're sending people into space in record numbers, and they get the best of the best. And the others, other people who are not genetically engineered, end up being in very service level positions, and that's a central theme in the story. Our hero, I will say, may or may not be in one of those classes. That's to find out in the movie. So what happens is we have a child is born, either genetically engineered or not, and for the purposes of this movie, a drop of blood is taken from that baby and put into an analyzer, and immediately everything about the baby's life is determined in probabilities. If they're genetically engineered, they have a 10% probability of a disease, a 1% probability of mood disorders. Life expectancy is 80, 90 years. For the natural birth, and the movie has a very nice way of saying that, eventually genetically engineered children are deemed to be the natural way to be born. But for the ones who are not genetically engineered, probability of heart disease, 40%, probability of attention deficit disorder, 80%, lifespan, 30, 40, 50 years, all known at birth. And that's a really interesting part of the story, and definitely is one of the reasons that it's one of the plot devices that moves the story forward. So that's what's going on. We have this company that our hero works in. How did he get there? Who is he? And that's where the narration helps tremendously. And on top of that, Ethan Hawke, who is our hero in this film, that's the name of the actor, has this voice that is just warm and calm. And it's not yelling at us from the screen. It's not jumping out at us. It just talks about, in very matter-of-fact ways, his life, how he started, what his role is, what his dreams were, and how he got to be at Gattaca. And it's a great flashback of sorts. And the narration lasts for about 35 minutes. Now, it's not non-stop. It's on and off, over a 35-minute period. And then there's no more narration until the last 30 seconds of the film. So I find that this narration device works terrifically in this film. It helps us understand what's going on. We don't have to take, it's not a documentary, we don't have to take a chemistry course to figure out what's going on. We see it all. And there are hints right from the beginning about what's going on, with certain comments made by the lab technician in the company and other people that give us an idea of where we're headed. So there's nothing quite like foreshadowing to help us along with the story. The next element is the search for perfection. So if you are a genetically modified person, every single person thinks that they're the best at whatever they do. That's how they're designed, so to speak. And so there's a tension here between people who are expecting to be perfect, but of course they're not perfect. They have problems just like the non-genetically engineered people. And the movie has a very nice line where it says, "There is no gene for fate," and you'll see how that plays into the film. So that tension also exists in the film, and exists with our third character, Jude, who is absolutely central to the whole story. And then we have the romantic interest, and the film is really cool about how they deal with this, which means that if someone is interested, whether it's a woman interested in a man or a man interested in a woman, they get them what they call sequenced. In other words, they can take a piece of hair or maybe a coffee cup, get the DNA off that, and they can have it analyzed. And then the person says, oh, this person has a 90-year lifespan, has an IQ off the charts, perfect vision, and all kinds of things. So they think, oh, that's a good catch, whether it's a woman or a man. So that works really well in the movie. And so a budding romance means first you have to sequence someone to find out if they're good enough to spend your time with them, which of course brings its own tensions with it. You know, is it necessary to have to do that? Whatever happened to just meeting someone, going out for a drink and talking? And that's all addressed in the film as well. So that part is there. The next part is, and again another central plot device, is there's a murder. And let's just say that it's a murder that takes place inside Gattaca. And Gattaca has another thing. There's a timeline, 1 week. The other thing I like about this film, in that it's not like, well, the rockets are flying off everywhere and it doesn't matter what's happening in the universe. In the real world of science, the planets align very favorably at certain times of the year or years, and at other times they align very unfavorably. So in the movie, the rocket that our hero is supposed to go on is going to a moon of Saturn called Titan. But they only have a 1 week window in order to launch this rocket, and then the next best opportunity for such a mission is 70 years later. So they have a tight timeline, 1 week, and then there's a murder. So this creates plot tension as, will the murder disrupt the launch of this rocket? Does it affect our hero? Does it not affect our hero? These sorts of things are very much part of the film and provide some really nice tension in the film. Now, the other thing I'll say about science fiction films and what I don't like is, if you think about World's Fairs, like the New York's World's Fair of 1939, I think, and in those festivities, they often talk about the future. What will life be like 30, 40, 50 years from now? And if you've ever seen these documentaries and you look back on these films, they're surprisingly bad in their predictions. You know, flying cars and clothes that are completely unrecognizable, and all kinds of other things going on that really have nothing to do with what life was like 50 years after this World's Fair and almost 100 years later. And so one of the things I like about certain kinds of science fiction movies is they recognize the fact that change happens slowly. As I mentioned in the previous episode, a man's suit in 1920 is not that much different from a man's suit 100 years later. Haircuts, not that much different than 100, 150 years ago. Women's clothing, a little bit more style changes, but not a great deal. The change happens slowly. There are no flying cars. Yes, there are self-driven cars, which is fine, but the changes in the world over the last 100 years, they happen slowly. Now, there are some industries that change very rapidly. The computer industry in the 19th is very rapid. In the 19th century, the discovery of air travel, the expansion of rail travel, photography, the motion picture business, a lot of those things happen within 25, 30 years. So yes, those kinds of changes can be rapid, but other things just don't change like that. How much different is the car of today from when it was invented in, let's say, 1895, or when it was starting to be mass produced in 1905, 1910? There isn't a whole lot of difference. So I like science fiction films where they kind of acknowledge the fact that, yes, there are changes, but they aren't that huge. And in fact, in Gattaca, everyone in Gattaca wears a suit and tie. The women have something very similar to that. The men, they all have very close cropped hair. They all look very conservative. They're supposed to be emotionally very understated. I just think it's a really nice touch, and I find it much easier to watch than watching people that get into flying cars and wearing clothes that look, and sometimes they just look ridiculous, or at least hard to believe that that would be a fashion trend. And so that really appeals to me in that sense, and that's why I say that the science fiction film of 1997 is almost like today is not in the not so distant future is today, and not even 50 years from now, given that the ability to work with DNA is not as advanced as what they depict in the movie. Another interesting sidelight is in the movie, all the cars are electric. And I'll tell you, I have been on the street many, many times and had heard a van go past me, or a car, and they sound exactly like the cars in Gattaca. Now, that was 30 years ago. Like I said, I still feel like Gattaca was released just the other day, but it was released 30 years ago. And the sound of the engines in those electric cars in Gattaca sounds exactly like the engines in the electric cars outside this building right now. And I just think that, again, is that Gattaca predicted quite nicely this, or I don't know if they expected it, but maybe they did. But it certainly resulted in something that we can watch in a sci-fi movie, but that doesn't seem, that horrible expression, too far-fetched. The cars then sound like they do today. And we're not that far away from having more and more cars be completely electric, and the gas propulsion engine is gone. So that's our story. A company that puts people into space but only hires genetically superior or genetically engineered people, because that's the kind of investment they're prepared to make for these people, because they're more predictable, they are safer, they're more intelligent. The problem is our hero. Who is he actually? His name is Jerome Morrow. He's in Gattaca. He's fulfilling his lifetime dream of reaching for the stars, and the movie tells us how he got there, what his challenges are, and is it really going to happen. So It's a great setup with the narration and the first 30 minutes of the film really getting us exactly where we want to be so that we can follow along and see what's going to happen. The murder mystery, there's a police officer, so it's a bit procedural. Will the fingers be pointed at our hero? There's a romance. Will the romance be consummated? Will there be problems there too? There's a notion of perfection. Will one of our stars just not be able to grapple with his imperfections, given that he is genetically enhanced and he feels that he should be superior in all things? So will our hero, Jerome Morrow, make it to the stars? Will he decide that this newfound love derail him from his goal in his dreams? And will the murder mystery destroy the mission and just throw everything up in the air? So let's sit back and watch it unfold from the 22nd row.